Note: this pasta contains gore. If this bothers you, please do not proceed. The moonlight bathes Paris in a silver, calming hue, a breath of serenity amidst the turmoil of revolution. The city is asleep, deep in its midnight slumber. Only a lonely shadow moves in the stillness of the night, tiptoeing across the rooftops. It climbs effortlessly up a brick wall high above the ground, reaching a windowsill with an outstretched hand and pulling itself against the glass. It presses its hands against the wooden window frame and with a swift motion pulls up. The window clicks open and a shadow slips inside the dimly lit apartment. The place once belonged to the late magistrate, Pondicher, but after he was relieved of his post under dubious circumstances he committed suicide, and the place has remained abandoned ever since. Many inquired about the luxurious two-story apartment, but rumors of hauntings and strange sightings kept people away. Rigate wouldn't let old wives' tales scare him off an opportunity like this. Pondicher had amassed great riches during his time at the courtroom, but he had neither family nor heir, so his fortune should still be in his house. Gold coins, shiny jewels and various other trinkets awaited Rigate inside the deserted apartment. His lust for gold wouldn't allow him to pass such a lucrative occasion. He is now standing in a dimly lit corridor, with wooden, intricately carved doors on the sides leading to the other rooms of the first floor. Specks of dust are dancing in the moonlight coming in from the only window in the hallway. Faded paintings and portraits are hanging from the walls. Further down, a small, wooden table, with scratches on its legs, is covered by a tattered cloth. Two tiny portraits probably depicting Pondicher and a woman with the faces scratched off are placed on top of the table. Rigate walks carefully down the gloomy corridor, the wooden floor creaking loudly under his feet. He enters the first room on his right. This must be the study, he thinks. A large bookcase covers the back wall. Piles of old tomes are heaved onto the various furniture stools, a music player, even a small piano around the room. Rigate approaches an equally untidy desk in the middle of the study. Immediately his eyes dart towards a silver pocket watch partially buried under a pile of stained papers. He grabs it and puts it into an inside pocket of his coat. His focus shifts to the center of the desk, where a large book lays open. A thin layer of dust covers its parched pages. Rigate tries to read a few lines, but discovers that the book is written in an unknown language, Greek if he had to guess. Intrigued, he turns page after page, until a crumbled piece of paper falls on the ground. He picks it up. Rows and rows of complete gibberish, with a few lines crossed off. A list, of sorts. Losing interest, he moves back into the hallway. He decides to check the first room on the left. As he steps under the dislodged door frame, he catches a glimpse of a shadow moving at the other end of the corridor. He quickly spins around. A curtain, torn and shredded, floats softly under the nightly breeze. He laughs at himself for being so jumpy. He has been in this kind of business for many years, the shadow's a second skin to him. He fixes his attention back on the room. This one is much more orderly than the study, but the sense of abandonment is still here. The red paint on the wall is starting to peel, revealing the yellowish plaster covering the brickwork of the building. Fine, aristocratic chairs are gathered around a marble fireplace with blackened from the smoke delicate designs. A ripped chair pillow is thrown in the corner of the room, next to a mahogany dresser. He walks towards that corner, where the faintest idea of a foul odor seems to emanate. Getting closer, a strong sulfuric stench fills Rigate's nostrils. Upon investigating the wall, he finds a large hole behind the dresser, broad enough for a small person to creep through, leading to the next room. Slowly, he kneels down to inspect further. Examining the broken wall, he spots dried blood onto the rim of the hole. Someone must have slid in, only to get cut by jagged edges and wood splinters sticking out. Who would go through there and why? And most importantly, was he still in the building? Rigate peeks inside the hole, his curiosity pushing him past the rotten smell. The room is bathed in almost complete darkness, bearing no windows and the only light source being the gap on the wall. Rigate can't make out much. The place is in much worse shape than the rest of the house and it is empty save for a battered sofa and a few overturned chairs. His eyes are beginning to adjust to the darkness, little details coming in view. He can now see the white paint on the wall that has dried and on some places has completely fallen off and, most strikingly, blood splattered across the wall and floor. To his horror, he discovers bloody fingerprints and smudges on the floor and lower wall, as if someone has crawled on all fours towards the corner of the room, which is just out of view. Rigate stretches his neck and presses as far against the wall as possible in order to get a better view, but the dark corner is still out of sight. Sick of the gruesome scene, he starts to retrieve himself from the hole. But a clanking noise roots him to the spot. He hears raspy, heavy breathing. Then a thumping sound, followed by a painful moan. Rigate's mind freezes. He hears the scraping of nails on the hard floor. Someone is dragging himself towards the opening. Rigate tries to move, but his limbs are numb from fear. The noise is coming closer and closer. Then, it stops, a low growl replacing it. Seconds pass. Rigate, pale-faced and wide-eyed, slowly pulls himself backwards. As he is getting up, a hoarse scream pierces his brain. Rigate rushes to his feet. A rattling of chains and thumping of limbs fills the thief's ears. Whatever is on the other side is lunging towards the hole. Rigate runs out of the room, slamming the door behind him, the force bringing down the door frame. He rolls to the side, narrowly escaping the falling door, which crashes to the floor, raising a fog of dust. He runs out to the corridor. Whatever is in that room can go to hell. I don't care even if there's someone dying in there. Every man for himself, that's my motto, Rigate thinks as he turns towards the window, but the sight in front of him stops him on his tracks and sends shivers down his spine. A man drenched in blood is blocking his exit. His eye sockets are empty, a thick, pus-filled fluid dripping down his cheeks. The white rags thrown over his head don't cover much of his scarred body. A thick red line runs around his neck, like something tight was tied around it. 3 large nails are pinned on his right forearm, while the fingers on both his hands are cut into short, grisly stumps. Rigate, mortified by the ghastly sight, backs down the corridor. With trembling hands he tries to grab on something to steady himself, but his legs give way and he falls on his back. He quickly stumbles back on his feet, frantically scanning the floor for an escape route. Unable to spot the main door, he blindly runs up a staircase on his left. He glances over his shoulder, catching the monstrosity turning its head towards him, its mouth curved into the faintest of smiles. Distracted, he trips over the last step and falls flat on his stomach, his face pressed against a musty old carpet. He pushes himself up and takes a quick look around. This floor is much more claustrophobic than the first. The ceiling is hanging lower and the corridor connecting all the rooms is much narrower. One of the 3 doors is broken, revealing a small storeroom closet. Rigate lunges to the first of the 2. He wrestles with the doorknob, but the door remains closed. He runs to the next door. A nasty smell hits his nostrils. He hesitates, but knowing his options are limited, he pushes the door open. As the door creaks open, a gust of stale air bursts out of the room. Covering his nose, Rigate carefully peeks inside. Before he can get a view of the room, a little man jumps in front of him. He looks old and feeble, his frail framework trembling under his own weight. The few hairs left on his head are oily and a crust of filth covers his skin. "Welcome to the Wall of Art," he says in a high-pitched voice. He smiles, revealing a row of rotten teeth in his mouth. The old man steps outside the room, closing the door behind him. He is wearing a bloody white shirt, that once must have been very expensive, and he is carrying a small hammer in his right hand. He has no pants on, his swollen genitalia on display. Yellow and white marks run down his inner thighs. "Come in and marvel at the wonders hidden inside that little corner of our world." He gestures to Rigate, his bony fingers trembling. Rigate steps away from the man until his back is pressing against the wall behind him. "Don't be scared. Come in and stand in awe in front of the unearthly beauty of our exhibits," the old man says, stepping closer to Rigate. His mouth reeks of rot and decay. He extends a greasy hand towards Rigate's face. "Young lad, I assure you, the wall is unlike anything you have ever seen. It will elevate you, it will perfect you. You need the wall to be complete and the wall needs you. Step inside and become part of the art. A surge of adrenaline rushes through Rigate's body. He slaps the old man's hand away and runs for the staircase. The scarred man previously blocking the window is nowhere to be seen. Rigate's heart flies. He is so close to escaping this house of horrors, but as he sets foot on the first step, he freezes. At the bottom of the stairs, a woman, her joints twisted and her limbs rigid, is slowly crawling up the stairs. She twitches and squirms, trying to drag her broken body up the stairs. She is wearing a white, ragged dress and her forehead is adorned by a broken tiara. Her blonde hair has been torn off, with only a few patches left and those glued on her scalp and forehead by sweat and grease. Her glassy eyes are staring blankly at the ceiling while her head is bobbing lifelessly left and right. Out of breath, Rigate bolts towards the nearest door on his right, his weight bringing it down and his momentum carrying him to the other end of the room, straight into a pile of rotten body parts. Eyes and limbs and tongues and hair, all crammed into a heap of gore and flesh. Rigate gags, the revolting smell invading his senses. Clotted blood glues his fingers together, his hands a sticky mess of blood and hair. He tries to get up but he slips, crashing back down on the pile of dismembered limbs. "Sir, you aren't authorized to enter the backstage area," the shrill voice of the disgusting little man echoes in the room. "I will have to see you out, sir," he says, stepping through the door frame. He walks steadily towards the fallen thief, rolling up his bloodied sleeves and swinging his small hammer around. Rigate, accepting his fate, lies still and closes his eyes while the old man downs the hammer onto his head. The thief's eyes burst open, explosions of pain shooting across his body. He is lying on top of an unstable table, with the old man's figure looming over him, a hammer in hand. "Steady now," the old man says, bringing the hammer down on Rigate's hand. His vision becomes blurry, a sharp pain on his palm numbing his senses. Rigate looks at his right hand and, to his horror, finds a large nail penetrating his palm. The old man thrusts down with the hammer once more, pinning Rigate's hand to the table. The thief screams in agony. "Shush, young lad. You are ruining the magic. You will have plenty of time to scream later. Now I need you to be silent and let me concentrate on my work," the old man says, putting his hammer down. He pulls a wheeled storage cabinet from underneath the table and opens it. After hastily searching for the tool he needs, he grabs a large, mechanic pair of pliers which he rests at the end of the table, near Rigate's feet. The old man grabs Rigate's right foot and pulls it towards the pliers. The thief kicks and stomps, but the pain in his hand impedes his movement and he ultimately succumbs to the man's surprisingly firm grip. His foot is pushed between the pliers, two metal plates locking it in place. The filthy man steps back, a wry smile etched on his face. "What the fuck are you doing?" Rigate screams. The smile on the old man's face broadens. "I am painting. I am painting over nature's incomplete work, perfecting it," he says, using his whole weight to pull down a rigid lever connected to the mechanic pliers. "What the fuck is wrong with you, you sick bastard?" The metallic plates press down on Rigate's ankle. The grip becomes tighter and tighter. Rigate screams in agony, as his bones crack under the metallic grip. "There is no point in screaming, young lad. Nobody can hear you. You are only ruining your beautiful voice," the old man says, letting go of the lever. "And you want to be at your sparkling best when she plays with you," he continues, putting emphasis on the word she. The pliers around Rigate's ankle relax. The thief exhales in exhaustion. "Now." The old man claps his hands. "Before I leave you to her mercy, I will show you a glimpse of the greatness that awaits you," he says, walking towards the darkest corner of the room. Rigate stretches to see what the old man is doing, but his aching body limits his movement. Instead, he focuses on his surroundings. He notices red curtains covering the walls around him. They are heavy and thick and their surface curves slightly around strange bumps sticking out from the wall. Suddenly, he hears a rusty metallic sound in the corner behind him. Behold! The wall of art, the old man whispers in a hushed voice. The curtains part, revealing dozens of bodies hanging from the walls. Some are charred, others are skinned to their bones, and others are missing limbs. Large iron spikes are nailed on their heads, pinning them to the wall. They twitch and shudder spasmodically, as if they still try to escape their dreary fate. Rigate can only stare in horror, his mind numbed by the horrors of the cursed house. The old man stares at the bodies on the wall too, a puddle of drool ready to fall from the edge of his gaping mouth. After a few seconds of silence, he speaks. "Beautiful, isn't it? I have worked my whole life to achieve such elegance," he says, sweeping a tear away from his eye. "And you will be up here soon." He pauses. "Don't mind me asking, but, how do you feel? You must surely be humbled by the honor that has been bestowed upon you." Rigate spits at the old man's feet. "I don't blame you for this classless act. In time you will understand. You will understand that man is only a pawn in the hands of a higher force. Everyone is forced to play, everyone is forced to fulfill the plot that has been set for him. Like an opera play, where the singers can't deviate too much from the original work or they will be struck down." The old man says, walking up and down the room, marveling at the bodies hanging from the walls. "I loved going to the opera. I remember one night, when I went to see the opening of Mozart's Magic Flute. Oh, what a marvelous show that was. There, smitten by the maestro's divine touch, I fell in love. I fell in love with the Queen of the Night, played by the beautiful and majestic Josefina Rossignol. But I knew I couldn't have her. Have you ever felt the longing pain of a love that cannot be?" Suddenly, visibly shaken and angry, he punches the table near Rigate's broken ankle. "I was devastated. Such a graceful being could never stand by my side. I was consumed by heart-wrenching despair. Every moment away from her was a moment my heart skipped a bit. I was inconsolable. My life was spiraling swiftly into a hopeless abyss of misery. I only left my house to go to her performances, dreaming she would notice me. But she never did." The old man sighs and hangs his head to his chest. "One day, I mustered up all the courage in my heart to go and confess my love to her. So, I booked a first-row ticket to her next performance. I can't even remember what the play was, that's how nervous I was. After the opera was over and the actors retrieved backstage, I slowly made my way to her dressing room. With shaking hands I knocked on the door. She didn't answer. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door," he says, hiding his face in his bloodied palms. And there she was. She was indulging herself with another actor. My whole world collapsed around me. I don't know what happened afterwards. Maybe I died and went to hell. All I know is when I opened my eyes I was sitting in a chair in this very room, my love's mutilated body lying where you lie right now. Something had snapped inside me. I could feel it. I was broken. You have met her, you know. She was the one slithering her way up the stairs. My love, my first painting, reduced to a hollow shell of something once beautiful. I cannot hang her on the wall and be done with her. No, she won't let me," he emphasizes on the word she wants more. "I have to watch my love wilt and wither till there is nothing left of her. I had to chain her to a wall downstairs, that's how sad her deteriorating state made me." The old man snaps his fingers. "But enough with the chit-chat. My love is simply a work in progress. It is her that you should be scared of. The lady of the house. She is the one running this household. I am simply a painter. I paint her victims and she plays with them, feeding off their misery and suffering. The more beautiful the painting, the greater the satisfaction she gets." As he says that, he opens a toolbox waiting on a chair and pulls out a knife and a cleaver. "And now, it's your turn to get painted," he says, running his finger down the sharp side of the knife. Satisfied, he buries his hand in his toolbox, searching. Rigate sees his chance. Mustering up every source of strength in his body, he pulls his hand away from the spike, pinning it down, and rolls on his side, screaming. He comes crushing down from the table, his mind blurred by the pain. The old man turns around and stares at Rigate with eyes filled with hatred. He grabs a hammer and slowly walks towards the thief. Rigate reaches for his left foot, pulling out a dagger concealed in his boot. He grips the handle tightly with his left hand, his knuckles whitened by the effort. The old man swings at Rigate with his hammer. The thief easily evades the blow and stabs the man on his shoulder, but his broken ankle gives way and he falls flat on his back, his dagger flying out of his reach. The old man charges towards the fallen Rigate, but the thief kicks him in the knee, staggering him. Rigate struggles to his feet, leaning against the table for support. His adversary swings his hammer once more, but the thief catches his hand in midair. The two men wrestle, but Rigate manages to come on top, throwing the old man on the ground. By the time he gets back on his feet, the thief has already grabbed his dagger and is steadying himself for the oncoming assault. The old man charges once more. This time, Rigate feigns a move to his right but at the last second darts to the left, plunging his dagger deep into the man's gut. Despite the stinging pain on his ankle, he manages to balance himself and grab the old man who has dropped his hammer and is holding his bleeding belly by the neck. The old man's face suddenly drops, a sad and tired look resting over his eyes. I once was Pondicher, the great magistrate of the Paris court. But now I die as a wretched worm. Oh, how cruel life has been to me, he says dropping on his knees. At last, I find peace. But the lady, oh, she needs a painter. Without one sh. Rigate slices his throat. He drops the dying man on the floor, letting him gurgle on his own blood, his face a visage of terror. A few seconds later, he draws his stern breath. Rigate drags him across the room, pulling him onto the bloody table. He puts down the dagger and grabs a hammer. He puts a nail on the side of the magistrate's head and thrusts down. A new piece of art is now adorning the wall. Credit to Mr. Dupin the wall. Credit to Mr. Dupin the wall. Credit to Mr. Dupin the wall. I'd never flown before. It was kind of peaceful, staring out of the little oval window to my right. It was the perfect time to think. I thought about the fight with my stepfather, and my mom begging me not to take this trip, citing news articles about missing and murdered locals. I thought about how I had pointed out that tourists hadn't had any trouble. I thought about how I might find happiness and never come back. We landed in Cardiff International around 9 p.m. on time, and I decided to walk to my small hotel. After getting settled I wasn't ready for sleep, so I decided to walk around for a bit. The streets surrounding my hotel were pretty enough. Flower gardens along the sidewalk and clean streets. But the streets just a little beyond were seedier than I had prepared for. The bums were out, occasionally trying to gain my attention, as walked by, in the hopes that the silly tourist had a little extra cash. The streets were lined with small shops, all them closed, and some for good, as well as unsavory-looking bars, all wide open. As I was entertaining the thought of dipping into one, and charming an attractive Welshman with false stories of my grandeur back in America, I heard a crash ahead of me. It was the sound of a young man, 20, if not a teen, landing on top of a trash can. Trash bin? I made a mental note to ask someone. Behind him a young woman, wielding a wooden bat, and sporting enough tattoos and piercings to make my mother shake her head, was yelling at him in a thick Welsh accent, about attempting to steal, again. The man ran off into the night, the woman yelling after him. The woman abandoned her verbal assault, and began riding her trash can. Trash bin? I think we both heard it, at the same time. A primal sound beneath a gurgle and the sound of feet pounding the damp cement. The young woman swung around, just in time, to catch the underside of the rabid, bloody man's chin. His eyes rolled back, for a moment, before regaining his footing, and resuming his attack. I started yelling for help, and police. The girl started bashing the man's head as he tried to claw and gnash at her. A few stepped out of the bar to catch the actions, and immediately jumped on their phones, calling cops, and taking pictures and videos. It wasn't until the man laid still, his head like hamburger meat, that the lady backed off, bloodied, and shaking. I ran to her, and grabbed her arm to keep to her still. I asked if she was alright, and she yanked her arm from my grasp, muttering that she was fine. The local police arrived a moment later, and I was pulled several directions for witness statements. After a dizzying list of questions, I accepted a ride to my hotel, and only had enough reserved energy to shower and climb into bed. My nightmares were dark and full of rabid, bloody people trying to eat my flesh. I woke up feeling as if my energy was drained while I slept. I could only stomach coffee as I thought about the previous night, and the animalistic man. His dilated eyes and bloody mouth were enough to make me want to run home, but my curiosity about the young woman dragged me out of my door. I wanted to see if she was okay, and if she had seen what I remember seeing. As I made my way through the old streets, I noticed they weren't so intimidating during the day. The bars were closed, and the shops were open, a few people going in and out, little bells ringing. The bums were gone, likely run off by shop owners, and the street had been swept. I found the woman's shop open, luckily. I walked in and wasn't quite expecting the scene. Deep-colored walls, and a couple plush, dark, velvet couches, with a large skull-covered hookah perched on a small side table. Racks, everywhere, covered in clothes, purses, masks, and a lot of neon and dark furry things, unidentifiable by shape. Surrounding the check-stand was a case full of movie replica weapons, and little racks of buttons and patches. I heard the young lady call, from the back, that she would be out in a moment, and I followed the sound of her voice. As I walked up the archway of the back room, I noticed a small apartment, before the view was blocked by the woman stepping through. Recognition loosened her smile, and she turned slightly sour at my appearance. "Can I help you?" she asked. The tone in her voice suggested she didn't care to help me. I wonder if I should ask her about the trash can versus trash bin thing. Just to get the ball rolling. I decided, instead, to jump into it. "That man, last night. Did you see his eyes and bloody mouth? Or did I imagine that?" "I saw it." "Why? Is that normal?" "Yes, all of us are born wild-eyed, and bloody-mouthed. Most of us just hide it well." She rolled her eyes and began unpacking some boxes of clothing, behind the register. I think she was hoping I would leave after she made it obvious I was being ignored. I'm not normally so easily deterred, but my coffee-filled stomach was starting to bother me, and it occurred to me that I hadn't eaten in nearly 24 hours. I left without another word and decided to try the cafe a block from my hotel. I still had so many questions about last night, but the boutique owner wasn't the best conversationalist. I made a plan to talk to some of the bar patrons, tonight. My plan was interrupted by a man screaming, just around the corner, ahead of me. Another man came running from the corner, ashen-faced, and checking over his shoulder as he passed me. I ran to screams, and rounded the corner, only to get smacked in the face by the most horrific vision I had ever witnessed. A man and woman bent over a man's body, holding him down and ripping pieces of flesh from his bones, shoving it in their mouths, while the living man screamed in terror and agony. I could feel my coffee coming up, and I let out a small cry. It was enough to gain the attention of the devourers, and they eyed me, for a moment, with curiosity and hunger. The woman went back to her meal, but the man wanted to move to greener pastures, as he lunged forward for me. I turned tail and ran, as fast as I could, back to the only place I knew. The woman met me with a scowl. "What the hell do you want, now?" she asked, as I slammed her door shut and spun the lock into place. "What the feck do you think you're doing?" she shouted, grabbing her bat, and heading for me. "No. Wait. There are more of those people out there. Please, I can't go back out there, we have to lock the doors." My defense was validated by immediate pounding and growling behind my back, which only intensified the woman's aggressive stance. "You brought them here? You'd what? Are you trying to get us both killed?" They were eating a man. Eating his skin while he was still alive. "What are they?" I yelled, over the din of the beast just outside of the thick wood door. I couldn't stop the tears brimming my eyes. The woman's features softened, slightly, at the sight of my tears, but her voice held the same tone. Stop your sniveling, it's not helping anyone. Throw the locks on those windows. She nodded to one side of the doors and she headed for the other, swinging down iron locks, and pulling the windows shut. I followed suit, and bit back my tears as I struggled a little with the awkward locks I'd never, before, encountered. Eventually, I got all of my windows locked and covered. When I turned around, the woman was back at her counter, hanging up and redialing the phone. I can't get through to emergency services, the line is engaged. Looks like we're on our own for the time being. I could feel the tears welling up, again, and my stomach felt like it was imploding. I couldn't tell if it was from hunger, or anxiety, now. I went and sat on the purple, velvety couch, and regretted not being able to appreciate the sandalwood smell and soft cushion. I took a few deep breaths and tried to sort my thoughts. We needed a plan. I needed food. I decided to ask if she had food, when it occurred to me that I didn't even know her name. My name is Deanna. I volunteered, hoping she would return the response with her own name. She shot me an annoyed look, instead. That's nice. She didn't look like it was nice. What's your name? I asked. She gave an exaggerated sigh. Chloe, she said, obviously not wanting to have a conversation. I sat in silence for a while, a little afraid to ask for anything. Chloe disappeared into the apartment, but I was afraid to follow. Surviving meant not pissing off my very edgy apocalypse partner. After a while, Chloe returned with 2 cups of tea, offering me one without speaking. I thanked her, quietly, and sipped it. I wasn't about to tell her I didn't like tea. I drank it, anyway, and it helped my stomach. A little. Chloe returned, again, with 2 bowls of chili, and some bread. I fought my urge to shove the food in my face as quickly as possible. I took great pains to eat normal-sized spoonfuls of chili, and chew my bread. I thanked Chloe, and received a curt welcome in return. The banging had stopped, nearly an hour before, but the screams in the streets were still audible. I didn't want to look. Could we turn on a radio, or something? I asked, hoping to drown out the noise. You want us to draw attention to ourselves? Feck that. You can go outside and hold up a sign that says free food, but I'm staying quiet. I went back to shutting up, and pulled my legs to my chest, tucking my chin between my knees. I thought about the fight with my stepfather, and about my mother's warnings. I thought about my pursuit of happiness, and how I may never come back. Chloe? Do you think these things have anything to do with stories about disappeared and murdered people that have been popping up lately? Maybe. Those stories were in the countryside, though. Miles from here. We weren't too worried about it. Maybe they just discovered the city. It's a much bigger food source. I cringed. You're probably right. Doesn't change much, though. We don't know what's going on, or why, so I guess we just sit here and wait for the military to roll through. You think they'll come? I asked, hopeful. They always do, in the movies. Only place I've seen this kind of thing before. That was fair, I guessed, and warmth of the food in my stomach made my eyes heavy. As I drifted off, I asked Chloe, is it called a trash can or a trash bin, here? Bin. She replied, and I fell asleep. I awoke, in the evening, to the sound of one of the windows shattering. I saw Chloe, to my left, leap off of her couch, shaking off sleep. She ran for her bat, and began battering the bodies pushing through the curtains. One slipped through the left edge of the curtain, and I recognized the woman from the street. More bloody than before, she ran at me, hands clawed, and mouth wide, emitting the same gurgling howl heard the night before. I ran, my eyes darting around for a weapon. I spotted a replica hatchet, from a movie I didn't recognize the name of, and snatched it up. I was immediately thankful for how solid it felt. I buried the hatchet in the woman's unblocked face, but she continued, unaffected. My arm, however, certainly noticed the impact, and it took a second to regroup before yanking my ill-chosen weapon from her skull. I swung, again, but my aim wasn't as true, as the blade slid past her cheek and hit her shoulder. I stumbled away, backing into the counter. There was a statue to my right, some kind of Greek or Roman goddess. I didn't have a lot of options. I could only hope it was heavy enough to damage. It was. I swung, as hard as I could manage, down on top of the cannibal's head, and she stumbled. Yes. I swung, again, and again, until she laid still, her skull cracked, and her brain looking much like this morning's chili. Chloe called for me from the window, struggling with the two men trying to push their way in. I jumped into the row, and we managed to beat them back. Chloe yelled for me to her, and grabbed a hold of a large painting on the wall. It was painted on wood, thankfully, and we put it up to the window. With limited resources, we had to wedge it in. But it would do for the moment. A bloody Chloe, short of breath, stumbled back to her little apartment. This time I followed, feeling a bit more worthy. Chloe was leaned over the sink of her kitchenette, washing the blood from her arms. I noticed the gash in her arm. "You're bleeding," I practically shouted, unsure of what else to do. "Well spotted," she bit, sarcastically, wincing a little as the water ran over her wound. "I think I cut myself on the glass, pushing the freaks out. Grab me the alcohol out of the cabinet, will you?" She nodded. So a small separated room, which turned out to be the bathroom. I found the alcohol and some rags, and we made a makeshift bandage. Chloe collapsed onto one of the couches, and reached into the drawer on the table, beside her. She pulled out a gun. The thing looked ancient, and too big. It had one of those chambers that spun around, and a little hammer in the back. It reminded me of something a cowboy would draw in a standoff. "It was my grandpa's," she said. "It shoots." In answer to my look of doubt. "Here," she said, handing me the piece. "I'm obviously no good, I can barely lift it. I need to rest, you man the fort." She snorted something, almost like a laugh, and with a labored breath, she drifted off. How much blood had she lost? When her breathing got heavy, I left her in peace. I figured I'd look around the shop, a bit, while I had time to myself. I found some matches and a pack of candles in a junk drawer, near the sink. It was a good thing, because the shop was nearly black with the curtains drawn and a window boarded up. I looked at the furry things first. There were vests, leg warmers, hats, and gloves. Some were glittery, and some lit up with rainbow LEDs. In a corner, there was a collection of latex clothing, with hints at BDSM. I decided to avoid that corner. One wall was adorned with gas masks, goggles, and masquerade masks. I tried on an elaborate white mask, covered in feathers and pearls. Who buys this stuff? It was obvious this wasn't a Halloween shop. I guess I'll never understand people. I heard Chloe moan a bit, in the bedroom. I went to check on her. Before I made it to the dimly lit archway, leading into the apartment, I heard a familiar gurgling coming from inside. My stomach dropped. My pace slowed and I drew the gun, pulling back the hammer like they do on TV. "Chloe?" I called quietly. I hesitated at the doorway. I was rewarded with a response, but the one I hoped for, as a wild-eyed, bloody-mouthed Chloe jumped in front of me. I reacted by pulling the trigger on the heavy pistol. The impact knocked us both backward, but I was faster to recover, grabbing the door, and swinging it shut, on her. I grabbed a cushioned chair from nearby and wedged it beneath the handle. Chloe howled and screamed from the other side, banging, mercilessly, on the door. Unfortunately, her wild noises drew the attention of her beastly brethren in the streets and they began assemble at the front of the store, pounding on the windows, door, and painting covered hole. As the board fell from the sill, it ripped the curtain down with it, revealing a few howling silhouettes, and an outline of street lights. I was trapped. I fired at the shadows, knocking one back, and only stumbling from the kick. I was feeling a bit more confident, now, and fired at another, barely losing my footing. I fired again, almost giggling as I hit one in the head, effectively exploding part of his skull, and dropping him. As I sent another bullet flying, it dawned on me that I had only one bullet left. Any hope of ammo was trapped in the apartment with my short-lived companion. As a handful more figures poured through the window, I ducked behind a rack, in the darkness. I had to make a decision. Do I fire my last bullet, and attempt to escape? Or save myself from a long and painful death? As I weighed my options, I heard the gurgling voices multiply. I made a decision. With iron resolve, I pulled my legs to my chest, and tucked my chin between my knees. I put the gun to my head. I thought about my stepfather, and my mom. I thought about how I was never coming back. Credit to Amanda Lawrence back. Credit to Amanda Lawrence back. Credit to endless. Dark. That was the road in front of me, stretching out farther than the eye could see in this inky blackness. Not a star in the sky tonight, and the moon seemed to be hiding from view as well. That was okay because I actually preferred the dark stretch. I found it calming to drive the narrow strip alone in the night. It wasn't often I had the opportunity to drive it and visit my parents in the country, and I was excited to see them. It had been a long time. Too long. Being an only child, my parents had been devastated when I informed them I was moving to the city. With that being said, they of course supported me and invited me to visit often, which is how I found myself driving out after work. It was a long weekend, so I could stay Friday and Saturday and head back to the city on Sunday to have some me time. The road had been fun when I was a child. The hills and bumps always had me lifted off my seat, giggling and shouting wee-yee. Every time we hit a large hill, my stomach would drop. I smiled at the memory, speeding up a little, intending to replicate the experience. The radio blasted a pop song, up way too loud to be good for anyone's ears, but let's be honest, it wasn't like the music was that good anyway. I checked the speedometer. I pressed a little harder on the gas, confident that I could maneuver this particular road with little danger. My car loyally leapt over the hills, bouncing me off my seat time after time. I laughed as my stomach flipped and flipped. I saw a curve up ahead and I started to gently hit my brakes. Just as I was going through the curve, a flash of blue up ahead caught my eye. "Stop!" someone screamed. My reaction to seeing a person standing in the middle of the road was to stop immediately to avoid hitting them. When I saw it was a young girl, I felt a wave of guilt crash over me. I almost hit that girl. I admonished myself. Her dress was a pale blue, torn at the hem and at the shoulder. The tear in the shoulder neatly matched the scratch on her arm, so I guessed she must have been running and caught a branch. Her hair was wet, matted down on one side, and she looked panicked. I felt sorry for her, but I was also scared. Did I help this girl? What was she doing in the middle of the road at this time of night? She stared at the car for a second, and then began screaming again. "Help me. You have to help me. He's going to kill me," she cried, running toward the car. I had the doors locked, but her sudden movement had me reaching for the lock button. I glanced around but I didn't see anyone else. Suddenly, I saw a man break through the bushes on the left. He was tall, with dark hair and a thick beard. Most importantly though, he was covered in blood and holding a knife. He seemed to look around for a minute, taking in the car's bright lights, and then noticed the girl. He started in the direction of the car, obviously going after the young girl who was frantically pulling at the door handle. "Please," she cried, tears pouring down her face. More afraid of the bloody bearded man than the child, I pressed the unlock button hurriedly. "Get in! Get in!" I practically screamed, my heart racing. The man was so close to the car now, any second he was going to reach it and kill us both. The girl slammed the door shut and locked it just as the man reached the front of the car. "Get out of the car!" he screamed, banging his fists against the hood. The girl cowered in the seat, taking in the environment of the car and stealing a glance at me. She didn't respond to him. "Get out of the car right now. It's for your own good," he said emphatically, banging his fists on the hood again, knife gleaming in the headlights and the glare momentarily blinding me. Suddenly, he began to move from the front of the car to the driver's side window. "Please get out of the car," he pleaded, his voice a little different this time, almost begging for her to get out of the car. I looked at him and noticed for the first time that he was looking at me. please get out. You've made a mistake. You don't know what. I felt something hard and cold slide through my lower ribs. I cried out in pain and looked at the girl incredulously. With a malicious smile, she slowly began to twist the knife. Me. He had been warning me. Credit to K.R. Shan. Credit link, K.R. Shan on Facebook. Soft beeping from my alarm woke me that morning. The same sound as always, a pulsing of noise that was like a heartbeat. Over the years, I'd grown used to the noise signifying another day at the station. I was positive about my lack of work, but I could just feel some new and horrific case would be looming over me soon. Turning my clock off to prevent it waking my slumbering wife, I pulled myself out of bed and got dressed. I had breakfast and read the news, old cases printed on the cover. Almost in sync with my need to get up and head over to the station, a knock came at my door. Back to the grind, I hummed as I kicked my shoes on. On opening the door I found my work partner, a spry woman in her late 30s with curly red hair pulled back into a ponytail. She wore a light brown coat and a sweet smile. "Morning, Harrison," she chirped before pushing a coffee into my hands. "Boys want you over at Saints Lane apartment block. Seems they've found a body." I took the coffee from her, same one she gave me every day, and sipped it. About time we got some more work. Smiling, I closed the front door and headed to her car. Sharon Whittingham, to give her full name, was a detective like me. I trained her and was expecting her to move to a new city once she was trained, since she had the skills to go far. But she, like most people who live here, stayed. Within half an hour we arrived. The complex we found ourselves at was the kind people tell of in ghost stories, old, damp and half-empty. It was once a low-cost housing ideal from about 50 years ago, but the only thing it kept after countless contractors had pulled out was the low cost. A few squad cars were already outside, their lights flicking on and off rhythmically. From what Sharon had told me, we knew the body was that of a young male, about 23 years old. We were trying to hunt for his family, but as yet didn't have many leads. I ran through the notes in my head as we ascended the 4 flights of stairs, up to room 307. Yellow and black tape was hung about the place, stopping the other dozen residents of the complex from getting in. The door had been broken in by our own forces in an attempt to see what the source of the foul smell in the complex was. Little had been disturbed in the apartment itself, a few things like pillows were on the floor but nothing to suggest a struggle. Sharon headed into the bedroom of the apartment and nodded her head towards the body. Grimly I followed her in. There, lying naked on the bed was a young man, with black hair, green eyes and a few studs. His body was a mess. Most of his chest had been pulled open and the lungs and heart partially removed, clawed out by long nails. Though his death looked horrific, the young man had a peaceful look on his face. "What a sorry sight," I commented, walking over to the body to take a closer look at the gaping wound in his chest. "That's what I said," Sharon nodded, looking around the bedroom. "This case looks like an odd one. I mean, just look at this room. It's immaculate, not a thing out of place. It doesn't look like there was a struggle to me." I nodded in agreement before looking at the man's side table to inspect it for clues. I pulled some gloves on and started to leaf through his possessions. "Has anyone reported hearing a disturbance here in the past few weeks?" "No, the kid hardly made any noise, it seemed. He moved in a few years ago. Didn't go out much or have many people over." "Do we have a name?" Yeah, I think so. He called himself Joshua Brown. He was working near here, at a restaurant as a waiter." "I see." I moved back from the small bedside cabinet, making note of a framed photo by the lamp. The image was of the boy, Joshua, in his late teens with another boy with long white hair, snowy skin, and a pink jumper. They looked happy together. Just as I was about to stand, I noticed a few empty packets of contraceptives on the floor. I picked them up carefully and placed them into a clear plastic bag before showing them to Sharon. "Do you think he knew his killer?" Sharon eyed me for a moment. She always said I had an odd way with words. "Well, he could have done it with his killer before he met his maker, so to speak. She pondered for a moment before spotting the photograph. If we look at it from that angle, it's totally plausible. We should try to see who he knew, who his friends and lovers were. Unless it was a one-night stand, of course. I nodded and wandered around the room some more. Get someone to look into his mobile phone records, computer and whatever other communication device he has. That'll be a good first lead. We should also be able to get some DNA from this place, if we need to identify. You talk like such an old man sometimes. Sharon smiled. If we get this to court, we should be able to prove who did it. We just need to find the one who did the deed. I stifled a chuckle. You talk like a teenager sometimes, Sharon. I knew full well my comeback had no effect. Let's hope we can get whoever did this. As if we ever let them get away. I smiled at her optimism and continued my search. As expected, a good number of DNA samples were recovered and sent off to the lab while Sharon and I spoke to his neighbors to see if anyone knew Joshua. They all said the same thing. As far as they knew, he was a very quiet lad, though his appearance may have suggested otherwise. He was kind, didn't talk about himself or his family much. We were still finding it hard to get in contact with his parents, or the boy in the photo, whoever he was. The few photos around Joshua's flat were almost all of the albino teenager, and we guessed they'd probably been partners at some point. Working on that assumption, we'd started to construct a story that the two had probably split up or moved apart but had met up again recently, and the albino had, after intercourse, killed Joshua. It was a little flimsy, but we had to start somewhere. It was long after 11 that night that I finally took a taxi home. In the heat of the moment I'd lost myself in work and I'd lost all track of time. Only when I saw it was so late did I at last leave. I arrived home and was met by my darling wife. Even now, 43 years after first meeting her at college, she hasn't lost her looks in my eyes. Even after she had her first stroke, I still loved her looks. They do say love is blind after all. "Good evening, love," I said with a soft voice. You could say that me and my wife, Annabelle, were the ideal model of what an old married couple should be, still as close as ever. Though I now had a full head of silver hair, I hadn't retired. After my wife's first stroke, she'd wanted our lives to stay the same. She stayed at home and rested while I went to work. I loved my work and the money it brought and helped to pay the medical bills. "Evening," my wife replied after a short pause. "How was work today?" I embraced her and smiled, not giving her an answer other than a happy moan. Annabelle hugged me back, smiling. I hated telling her about my work, the death I saw, so I hid it from her. For the rest of the evening we simply ate dinner and watched TV, before falling asleep at about 1 a.m. The next day started the same. My alarm started softly to raise me from slumber, and then I left to greet Sharon. She filled me in on some of the developments that had happened since we spoke last. The body had been moved from the apartment and we were now free to do a deep search. Joshua's laptop had been found and was in the lab, being pulled apart for information. I needed confirmation that nothing had been missed, so I rode with Sharon to the apartment. The place was quiet as we went in, the smell of damp stronger than ever now. On entering the apartment we found that little was out of place, thanks to the hands of our experienced team. I started to look about, first going through the kitchen and then the living room, followed by the bathroom, then the bedroom, looking in more detail than I had done before. I made a note that the kitchen was poorly stocked to feed 2 people and that the only clothes belonged Joshua. Sharon and I quickly came to the same conclusion, that he was living alone at the time of his death. My gaze turned back to the bed. Most of the covers had been taken away, but there was still some dried blood on the mattress, outlined by tape to show where the body once lay. I looked at Sharon, who was rummaging through the dresser to the right of the small window that gave light to the room. On top of the dresser there were a number of small trinkets, including a photograph of the albino boy, a freestanding cross with a rosary hung about it, and a copy of the Bible. "See anything, Sharon?" I asked, slowly walking over to look over her shoulder. "Well, he was into his religion, but it looks normal enough." She pondered, tapping the side of her neck in thought. I nodded in agreement, coupling this with a small noise to signify I thought she was indeed correct. I'd like to know who the albino boy is, he looks to be a bit of a theme here. Possible suspect? I can't be sure until we find him, but it's within reason. I picked up the photograph and removed it from its frame. For a moment I studied the image before noticing something as I held it to the light. Dark patches. Careful to not damage the deceased's possessions, I turned the image over to see writing on the back. It read like a love letter, short, sweet and simple. It was sunny that day, like the sun, you light up my day, my angel. I quoted aloud. Sharon looked back at me in puzzlement for a moment before realizing I was reading something. Is there something on the back of the photograph? With a nod, I handed over the image. No name, sadly. Like me, Sharon studied the writing. At least we know now that the two of them were dating. A bit tacky if you ask me. I chuckled. When you find love you'll learn that there is no such thing as tacky. You know full well I have no intention of finding love, Sharon responded flatly. She'd explained to me before that she wasn't interested in any kind of relationship that wasn't work of friend based, she enjoyed her solitude. We'll see. I smiled back before going to inspect the other images. Let's try and find the name of the albino boy, that's our first task. Sharon agreed before hunting about for more photos to see if any others had messages on the back. Sadly, we were out of luck. After collecting a few more of the young man's possessions, we headed back to the station to try fit the links together and to wait on the labs to give up more information. It was past 4 when I got a call from the station's pathologist, a towering blonde-haired man we all lovingly called R. He was from Russia and had one of those very tricky names with a great number of K's and V's in it. He told us he had news about the body and asked us to come over as soon as we could make it. I told Sharon and we headed over to his lab, on the other side of town. R was a workaholic like myself, and often pulled all-nighters, against his better judgment. We headed into the small clinic and were buzzed into the main lab by R's young receptionist. R greeted us at the entrance to his lab. His long blonde hair was pulled back into a ponytail that often sat on his shoulder, his eyes were a soft blue and he wore a long white lab coat. On his right wrist he had a small gold bangle which I'd never seen him remove. His skin was very white, and he often wore a somewhat blank expression, the kind you see on the face of someone who's lived with death for many years. I saw myself in R sometimes. Harrison, Sharon, glad you could make it over here so quickly. R smiled, holding out a hand. I took his hand and shook it. Well, you know what we're like, eager to get things done. Good to see you again. R had worked for us for about a year now. Before that he was a GP, a very good and caring one too, but after a tragedy struck his family he started to work here. Sharon also shook R's hand before heading towards his lab. R smiled in my direction to thank me for the pleasantries. I knew he wasn't a talker. I followed and looked over to a metal table that presented the body of the victim, covered with a thin white sheet. What I found was pretty interesting really. A bit of a sick case though, the doctor commented, before pulling the cover down to reveal the upper half of body, folding the cover just under the wound in his chest. What do you mean? Sharon asked, walking over to look, while I admired from afar. As I see it, his rib cage was pulled open and then most of the ribs removed, followed by the consumption of the lungs and heart. There was a dumbfounded silence. You mean someone's eaten him? Sharon shouted, a little too loudly for R's liking as he was very sensitive to sound. Yes, eaten. R responded, a little agitated to have had Sharon shout at him. There are both large claw and bite marks on the remaining tissue. He signaled to a mouth-sized bite mark, consisting of many needle-like holes that was uncovered at the bottom of the rib cage. I felt a little ill just thinking about the notion of one human eating another. Those aren't human though, I mean look at them. Sharon exclaimed, as shocked as I was. Well, these bites come in sets of 2 and they're the right proportion to be human. Say the one doing the eating had possession of some kind of adapted weapon? Humans are strange creatures, you know. R's eyes, peering over his glasses, remained on the body. I paused. He did have a point after all. Maybe this was a far more twisted story than I'd first imagined. For the rest of the meeting, R filled us in on what else he'd worked out about the body and gave us his full report. After reading through the case notes, Sharon and I both headed home. Annabelle met me at the door and we chatted about our day, though I made sure to cut out as much of the gore as I could. I picked at my dinner and avoided mention of food for the most of the evening. Honestly, I was shaken by what R had told me, so much so that I could hardly respond to my wife. Around 10, I went to bed although I couldn't sleep. With the case on my mind, it was hard to think of anything else. Ideas rattled around my head. I arrived at the station by 7, a little early for me, but I felt like walking. There's something about walking, to arrive before anyone else, that's strangely enjoyable. By lunchtime Joshua's journal was released from the labs, with every page copied and recorded. Sharon went out again to ask around about the young man while I stayed put to read the journal. It was a few years old, but I thought it would still be in the right time span to possibly include information about the albino. I was right to assume it would. The journal was nothing special. It went from the teen's 15th birthday and stopped at his 16th. It started with the boy describing what he got for his birthday, a phone, the book he was writing in and a few trinkets from one of his friends. He spoke highly of his friend who I gather was known as Lyet. If Lyet was the name of the albino boy, then it should be easy enough to find him. After all, there can't be too many kids called Lyet in the US. For the next few hours or so I focused on nothing but the journal, making sure to take notes on pretty much everything about the teen's life that he wrote about. To my disappointment, there wasn't much of interest apart from a few briefly mentioned cases of bullying, some underage sex between the young Joshua and Lyet, and a few small social events that he and Lyet had attended. Joshua seemed to be very close to Lyet. He seemed to love him deeply, although it was mentioned that the boys never told their parents. The journal told of how Lyet was badly bullied at school and suffered depression as well as some other health problems. He took a lot of medications, an amount I'd consider to be unsafe. As the journal went on, things remained the same. The two lads stayed in secret and they kept their heads down at school to avoid attention. Slowly, I closed the journal with care before noticing that Sharon had come in. "Hey Harrison, how's tricks?" she inquired, coming over with some lunch. Gladly, I took it from her. "Well, it looks like we have a name to match a face now. It seems from the journal that Joshua was dating a boy named Lyet, around the age of 16, and it looks like a long-term relationship to me." Sharon picked up the book and started to skim it, along with my notes. "Reckon we've got our suspect's name?" "Seems so." "Well then, let's put it into the computer." Triumphantly Sharon collected the notes from the desk before heading over to the computer. Though my old legs had fallen asleep from the long time sitting, I raised myself and headed after her. By the time I arrived, Sharon had sat herself down at a computer and was punching in her login. Before long our files were open and the hunt was on. As expected, it didn't take long at all, although what I saw filled me with disappointment. Lyet Penhart, a white-haired male from a small town in Texas, was found guilty today of murder-suicide. The youngster, aged 17, shot dead his father, the town's resident priest, on Monday 17th of February. The verdict of the court can now bring answers to those affected by the event. Sharon sighed deeply, reading aloud the article that was before her. "Looks like we went down the rabbit hole on this one, Chief." I nodded, although I remained transfixed by the article. It was simple, with little detail, but there was a mention of 3 older brothers, a mother in her 40s, and the cause of death were both Lyet and his father. His father was shot in the chest and later died at hospital while Lyet shot himself in the head. Poor thing. "Yup. Back to square one it seems," Sharon commented. "We'll find other leads, you know, we can do this." I smiled, knowing this had probably knocked the wind out of Sharon's sails. She has this habit of sticking to one idea in a case, and only gives up on it if she is proven wrong. "I know. For a moment she just pretended to read the article before stopping herself, leaning close to the screen. You reckon Joshua would have known Lyatt's brothers? What do you mean? Well, Joshua's boss told me he was a bit of an introvert. He never really went out and hardly ever talked to anyone. Since the other residents in Joshua's complex never saw him with anyone, is it safe to assume that he knew the killer, since he wouldn't really invite a random stranger in? Say one of Lyatt's brothers came to town, Joshua offers them a place to stay, and then the rest is history. Sharon knew herself this could be a little bit far-fetched, but I knew she'd look into it. Find the family then. See if we can get more information, I suggested. Got it. On that, Sharon started to dig into our computers for more information about the family while I simply went to work organizing the files for this case, hoping to see a fresh trail. I arrived home at 7 again that night. I greeted my lovely wife and sat with her at the dining table. Though her mind was sometimes muddled and she wasn't always entirely there, I could see she was pretty excited today. Interested as to why this was, I slipped it into conversation over our beef stew. How was your day then, Annabelle? I smiled, happy in the knowledge that she seemed better today than she'd been in a long time. The doctors had warned of another stroke if she became stressed or was too active, so she often confined herself to the house, doing very little at all. It was as if she'd been prescribed loneliness, but some days she was happy to live like this. Oh, my day was lovely. She smiled, looking up from her meal. A very nice boy came over today, he was collecting for charity. Did you give them anything? I asked back, knowing my wife was a very generous person. Well, she said after a little pause, he was looking to collect clothes, so I gave him some of the shirts that are too small for you now, as well as some change. I tried to invite him in for cake and sandwiches. Her mind trailed off for a moment before she smiled. I invited him in for tea, but when he came in, he didn't eat anything, though he did say he was hungry. Odd boy. Often my wife would repeat her sentences, forgetting what she'd just said. That's nice. I've been meaning to get rid of thought shirts for a while now. I smiled. There was something about talking like this that always helped me get my mind off work. I allowed the conversation to continue until we'd finished dinner, then we watched TV and went to bed, just like most nights. It was a simple lifestyle, but I wouldn't ask for any other. For the next few days nothing happened of much note. All three Penhart brothers had alibis for the night of the murder, and so did the now single mother. Joshua's parents told us that their son hardly ever spoke to them, but they would come and collect his body soon. We found a few more leads, though they all ran cold sooner or later. The IT department was still working on the computer and the phone of the deceased. It was late. Few lights were on in the city, but I still burned the midnight oil, working through statement after statement about the young man. Every one of them said the same thing: Joshua never talked to anyone, never had anyone over, and pretty much never left his apartment, apart from when he went to work or went shopping. I was at a loss. Knock, knock. Hummed a familiar voice, baritone and tinted with accent. I looked up and saw R in the doorway, holding a few files. Like me, he was burning the midnight oil, though it was a little odd to see him in my office. I welcomed him in. Evening, doctor. R came in, sitting across from me at my desk, before taking my notes to read over them. Shouldn't you be at home with your wife now? Though I'd love to, I'm at a loss here, R. I'm not the man I was 30 years ago. He smiled. I watching him read over my notes before taking a look at the file he brought with him. Didn't expect to see you here so late. I wanted to hand over these notes. I've found some bits and bobs. He paused. Where are you with the case? I knew full well that R would not be willing to tell me anything about his finds unless I told him mine. He liked to trade information. It was one of his many odd tricks. Well, we've closed the case on trying to find the albino kid. Turns out our top suspect has been dead for years. We can't find any new leads. This job looks like it was done professionally, R, and I'm starting to wonder if we can solve it. I knew full well I was putting it on thick, being a pessimist, but I wanted to go over the top. The albino kid? Sharon mentioned him over some drinks. She was so hyped up about finding the supposed killer so quickly. I didn't want to tell her. Tell her what? I asked in response. Don't you know? I thought you looked into the Penhart incident? No, I thought it was an open-shut case. Was it not? R smiled knowingly. He always reveled in knowing things that others didn't. Not totally. The trial was a shambles, evidence was lost, statements pulled out and reports rejected. Originally it was going to be presented as a case of retaliation, an act of self-defense with the remaining parents standing trial for domestic abuse, but it was not to be. Closing the files he was reading, I watched a rather smug smile creep across the tall doctor's face. Lyatt's body went missing. I paused, half annoyed that I hadn't been told, but then also confused. Went missing? It sounded foolish, but R didn't usually lie. Yep, I knew the pathologist who was going to make an assessment of Lyatt's body before laying him to rest, but the night before she was going to make the report, the body just vanished, gone without a trace. That's total fiction, I exclaimed. A body can't simply get up and walk away. R nodded, then opened the file he was going to deliver to me. Up to you whether you believe me or not. Me and some work friends called it the body snatcher. When opened the file I saw some of the latest DNA traces found of Joshua's body, along with long strands of pure white hair. I couldn't think of what to say, I just sat silently, looking at the report. The hair was about the right length and color to belong to the albinos, but how could that possibly be? You're welcome, R hummed, standing up before leaving my office. Left alone with my thoughts, I felt my stomach turn over. I'd seen the reports from the other crime scene, the boy lying in a pool of his own blood and brain tissue, clasping a small revolver in one hand. It could have been the lack of sleep. Things no longer added up in that case, nothing made any sense to me. Theories buzzed and nagged at me. What if the death was faked? What if the body was stolen? What if? I stood up quickly, holding my head before groaning. The dead don't walk around, Harrison, get a grip. My lack of sleep was clearly apparent now. Pushing the files into my desk drawer, I headed home, annoyed at R but also deeply puzzled. My alarm did little to wake me the next morning, although the pounding at my door did. Sharon, who was far too peppy for this time of day, had just gotten news that the laptop's files had now been copied and were free to read. I hurriedly got myself dressed then left to join her. On the way in, she told me that they had found a full electronic journal, with the last entry being the day of Joshua's death. She was hopeful that this could be our route to finishing the case. Even if it was lacking detail, it could shine some light on the story leading up to the young man's death. Sharon pretty much sprinted to my office where a hard copy of the journal had been placed. Instantly she fumbled for the last entry. I, slower at my age, arrived just as she found the page. Sitting down in my own chair, I took out a notepad and waited for Sharon to read what it said. Okay, March 26th. She paused to find her words before a very puzzled look crossed her face. What's wrong? I asked. Nothing. Let me just read it. I could tell she was composing herself. Taking a breath, she started to read. I know God must be smiling upon me, my prayers have been answered and I have him back. Robbed from me, I'd given up hope that we could be one again, but we will be. He doesn't know what he is now, but I don't care. He's an angel now, the moonlight shows his true form. It scared me at first, but I know this was meant to be, I'll become part of him. I lie with him now as I type this, his skin is so cold and pure, like snow. He's yet to wake up from last night. He bit him pretty badly from animal instinct, but he's starving. My angel is starving. Tonight I'm not going to fight him. We can make a thing of it before his mind is taken by the moonlight. If anyone finds this, finds me. Just know that I wanted this, I wanted to save my angel from his hunger. There was just silence left between Sharon and me as she finished reading. Slowly she placed the papers down, looking a little ill. He let this person kill him? What in the world was he going on about? An angel? Pulling my gaze away, I stumbled upon the file I recognized from last night. I bit my tongue, then struggled to form a sentence. I want to know everything, who Joshua knew and who his friends were, those who went missing and those he moved apart from. In reality, I felt numb. This couldn't be real, could it? Sharon was as confused and disturbed as I was. Yes, Harrison. But what do you think he's talking about? He doesn't seem to be stable. I mean, the way he talks here is… well, it's odd to say the least. What in the hell was going on? I remained silent for a while. I don't know. I'm going to ask around town and see if I can learn anything. I paused. Alone. Sharon just nodded, knowing I was as perplexed as she was about the whole business. Taking my coat, I left, planning on walking over to R's place to chat with him, to see if he could talk some sense into me. The walk across town was long and laborious, and I held my head down for most of the way. Moving my way through the waves of people, I drew closer to the building where R worked. The sense of dread that had hung over me ever since last night, which had strengthened after reading the journal, felt so much greater now. The face and form of the young white-haired man was etched into my mind. I quickened my step onwards. Pushing the door of the clinic open, I started to head over to the front desk to call for R, but that was when I saw him. Alone and sitting on the furthest-most chair from the door sat a young boy. His clothes were tattered, his hair long and white. He looked like a ghost. His skin was marble. I felt a sharp inhale of air enter my chest. Harrison, what are you doing here? R called, walking around the corner. I snapped from my trance and grabbed his arms, trying to get him to listen. There, look there, As I turned to point to the boy, I saw that the chair was empty, as though I'd simply imagined him. R gave me a puzzled look. A chair? His accent sounded a little stronger than normal as he muttered, "Are you okay?" No words came out of my mouth, but I nodded, letting go of R. "Let's get you some coffee and give you a place to sit down, okay?" Without waiting for a response, R led me into a small conference room and got me to sit, before walking off to get some coffee for both of us. Taking long breaths, I tried to control myself. Don't let the stresses get to you. I tried to breathe slowly. Perhaps this was just a stress-related episode, but the only thing I could think about was Joshua and his killer, who in my mind was the white-haired teen. Before long R came back, a folder under his arms, along with 2 steaming hot cups of coffee. I knew the man had an addiction to coffee and would offer or accept it at any opportunity. Passing me my mug, I felt myself start to relax even before I started to drink. R sat across from me, placed his work down, then also started to drink. "What happened out there?" he asked after a short pause. "I don't know, I think the stress is getting to me," I responded flatly, hardly concentrating. R sighed then smiled. "How old are you, Harrison? You're in your 60s now, shouldn't you be living at home with your wife, retired?" I glared at him for a moment. "Doctor's orders, you need to rest, Harrison. Look, I know you enjoy this and your wife likes you to keep busy, but this job, this style of life, really isn't too good for you, considering." My face softened and I nodded a little. "This case in particular, why don't you leave it to Sharon and the other boys at the station? They're all up to solving it. I just don't think you should be working with a case like this, not after… well, you know. I've accepted what happened, R, and I don't want to retire. This job keeps my mind working." "No it doesn't, Harrison, I can see it in your eyes. I'm saying this not as a doctor but as your friend. You should stay with your wife and rest for a few weeks." R's voice had gotten softer. He knew my wife's time was short now. Finally, I nodded and agreed. For hours I just chatted with R about life. Looking back, I guess I did need to cut down my work hours and spend more time with my lovely wife. Night was falling as I started to walk home. People were buzzing around, migrating back to their homes from their long work days. I felt better about life, more relaxed. Passing by shop fronts and restaurants, I started to instinctively look at people, blocking out the bad images with nicer ones. A couple were courting in the park under the old oak tree. One of the town's resident homeless was sitting at a bus stop with his large headphones on, tapping his foot in time with an unknown song. A proud giant of a man was walking home with his young son, carrying a bag of football kit. A young woman in a blue dress was exiting a small store named Transformer. I reassessed her gender shortly after. I found myself smiling, feeling the tensions of the case melt away. A girl selling roses, a man going to work at a restaurant, a white-haired teen in a light purple jumper looking over at me with dead blue eyes. I stopped abruptly and looked back. The teen had gone again, vanished into the crowds. My mouth felt dry. This was just stress, right? I quickened my steps, feeling my body pump with adrenaline. A cab sitting at red lights, a scruffy man walking down back streets, the white-haired boy again, his neck purple like it was bruised. I walked faster still. The sky was orange as the sun set. The building to my right had 5 floors. The dumpster around the corner housed 3 bin bags. The white-haired boy again, his face wet from tears and pure white hair stained crimson. My eyes darted forward, away from the crowds and fell on him again. One eye was golden and seemed to be ruptured while the other was soft blue. His body looked so cold. I staggered back, but he vanished again, in the blink of an eye. Panicked, I started to run to the warmth of my home, my whole body shaking now. Breathless, I flew down my small street and fumbled for my keys before pushing the door open. Inside I tried to catch my breath, taking lungful after lungful of air. Exhaling heavily and looked around, the money pot that stood on a small table by the doorway to the living room was smashed on the floor. So too was one of the lamps, a picture frame, keys. I felt as if time had stopped as I became aware of the sound of erratic breathing and gasping. I ran around the corner into my living room where I saw my wife convulsing on the floor. Her eyes were unfocused, one half of her face slumped to the side, her mouth half open. She was having another stroke. Lunging forward I went to take her into my arms, but that was then I saw it. "So hungry," he murmured, one soft blue eye locked on my wife. He was thin, pale, cold. Moonlight poked its head out from behind the clouds for a moment, showing his true nature, vast wings of pure light and a halo, bloody white claws on both his hands and feet, bloody neck, head and mouth, adorned with hundreds of sharp teeth. As soon as the clouds covered the moon again, he reverted back to the corpse he was. My eyes were locked on it, the angel of death that sat and watched as my wife died. It was as if something had taken over the body of a young man and now wore his skin, like a well-fitting glove. "What are you?" I screamed. Its eyes remained fixed on my wife, stiller now, hungry. Starving. I turned to my wife, taking her in my arms. This seemed to confuse the angel, puppeteering the body it called home. It moved towards me and my wife. The moon shone on it again. The smell of rot was stagnant in the room. "Get back." It didn't listen, simply moved closer, licking its long claws. I want it. For a split second it vanished out of sight and my world went dark. I awoke to a pounding pain in the back of my head. I forced myself upright, before promptly clasping a hand over my mouth at what I saw. The starving angel was crouched over my wife's body, or what was left of it, pulling away at the chest mindlessly, pushing flesh and muscle into its mouth. I thought I would vomit, but grabbing for my handgun I took aim. His dead eyes looked at me through bloody white hair, not seeming to know or care what I was doing. "Get off her!" I screamed, before shooting all 5 rounds into its head. To my horror, the angel took every single one, reactionless. Every bullet fell back out the hole it had made, bringing a pungent smell of rot with it, before closing up. Though it was futile, I continued to click the trigger of my gun, though nothing came out. I shouted and screamed, but it just continued to eat. The neighbors arrived a short time later, reporting that they found me with the body of my wife, crying and screaming at monsters. Sharon and the rest of the police force arrived shortly after and took me to hospital and my wife to the morgue. No trace of the angel was found, But I know what I saw. I saw him at the funeral, at the side of my wife's grave, by the roadside, watching the world and all its death. Since that night, I've retired from the police force and live alone. Stress is causing me heart problems and R keeps warning me I could have a heart attack if I continue to live the way I do, but I know I don't have much time left anyway, since the angel is back, and he keeps telling me he's hungry. I lie awake at night, the glow of his wings illuminating my room. If there is a God, he is nothing more than the monsters he has created. I can feel my chest getting tight as my heart fails me. I watch as the starving angel lifts his head and watches me with hunger in its eyes. Credit to 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 hunger in its eyes. Credit to